Summer 1942. If you're the Allies, you're looking out across the English Channel and, well, you're desperate. It's been too long years since Dunkirk. Fortress Europe, it just feels completely impenetrable, like this massive, heavily armed moat standing between you and hitting back. And the pressure, politically, militarily, it's relentless, especially from the Soviets. They need relief on the Eastern Front. They need a major strike against Hitler's Western Wall. Badly.
Absolutely. And all that desperation, that geopolitical necessity, the strategic thinking, it all kind of coalesced into this one single, incredibly high-stakes operation. We know it as the Dieppe Raid. The code name was Operation Jubilee, August 19th, 1942. And you really have to understand, this wasn't just a little poke. It was a massive amphibious gamble, huge, spearheaded mostly by the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, who hadn't really seen major action yet. We're talking over 6,000 ground troops, hundreds of ships, a massive air effort from the RAF. It was intended as a real test.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. We're going to unpack just how incredibly fragile that plan was and trace how it led to, well, an absolute catastrophe. We'll dig into the motivations behind it, some bold, maybe even reckless, the fatal mistakes made by commanders, often miles away from the actual fighting, and crucially, the lessons, the profound, really bloody lessons learned that day. Lessons that honestly shaped how the Allies eventually did win the war 2 years later on D-Day.
That context of Summer 42 is key, though. You can't understand Dieppe without it. Globally, things looked bleak for the Allies. The Wehrmacht was pushing hard towards Stalingrad. The Eastern Front was just a meat grinder for the Soviet Union. So Joseph Stalin, he's demanding, loudly, repeatedly, a second front.
Yeah.
Now, he argued pretty forcefully that the Western Allies had to do something big enough to pull, say, 40 German divisions away from Russia. This wasn't just a suggestion, you know. It felt like an existential requirement for the whole alliance.
Right, so this wasn't just about testing tactics or gathering intel, although that was part of it. Operation Jubilee was almost like a political payment, wasn't it? Delivered with troops and steel to show the Soviets, look, we're serious. We are going to open a second front eventually, even if a full invasion was clearly years off. And the British had been working on this stuff since Dunkirk, right? Developing amphibious warfare techniques.
Oh, absolutely. They'd set up combined operations headquarters specifically for that, refining techniques, developing specialized landing craft, all the kit they knew they'd need for a cross-channel invasion someday. It was a whole science they were trying to build.
And the first attempt at this kind of raid, Operation Rudder, what happened there?
Rudder was the initial plan. It was designed specifically to see if they could actually capture a port by landing directly against defenses. That was the big unsolved problem. They wanted to figure out fleet coordination, try out new gear, and frankly, give the Canadians something to do. They'd been training in Britain for 2 years, getting restless. Plus, you know, a morale booster back home wouldn't hurt.
But Rudder never even got off the ground.
No, it was a complete non-starter. Planned for July 42, but German reconnaissance planes spotted the ships gathering. Then they got bombed, add in some bad weather, and the whole thing was canceled on July 7th.
Which probably just cranked up the pressure even more, right? Now they really needed a success.
Exactly. The pressure didn't go away. It intensified. So they needed a target, and they needed it fast. Dieppe in Normandy got picked mainly for one reason. It was the biggest port they thought was within range of RAF fighter cover flying from England. Air support, even limited, was seen as absolutely non-negotiable.
But looking at Dieppe itself, geographically, it sounds like a nightmare for an attacker.
It absolutely was. The town sits in this deep valley, right?
Yeah.
Flanked by these long, really steep cliffs that just dominate the channel.
Yeah, you see pictures and it's obvious. You've got the riverside to the west, the Arc to the east. Yeah. They basically funnel everything towards the main beach in the middle. And that beach wasn't sand, it was shingle, which turned out to be a huge problem.
A fatal problem, as it happened. So the German garrison there, the 32nd Static Infantry Division, they weren't just relying on their guns. They had the terrain itself as their best defense. The whole Allied plan, therefore, hinged on one massive assumption: achieving complete and utter surprise. They thought surprise could somehow negate these huge natural and man-made defenses.
So that calm before dawn on August 19th, it was deceptive. The Germans were well dug in, comfortable, ready, and the Allies were banking everything on catching them totally off guard.
Which, as we'll see, didn't happen, not even close.
Okay, so let's talk about the Allied gamble itself. Operation Roundup, the full invasion, was off the table for 42. Too ambitious, too soon. So Dieppe, Operation Jubilee, became the substitute, the interim plan. And you said 2 main goals: grab intelligence on coastal defenses and, crucially, bait the Luftwaffe.
Yes, that Luftwaffe lure was absolutely central. You have to understand, RAF Fighter Command was hurting. badly. The Germans had introduced the Focke-Wulf 190, the FFW 190, and it was just better than the Spitfires the British were mostly flying at the time. Faster at certain altitudes, heavier guns, rolled incredibly quickly. British losses over France were mounting alarmingly.
So Fighter Command actually wanted this raid to force a big air battle.
They lobbied hard for it. The thinking was, if the Allies attack a port, the Germans will think it's the start of the invasion. They'll throw everything they have in the air to stop it. And that would create this huge, decisive air battle, but on British terms, closer to their bases, where the Spitfires could compete better. They hoped it would smash the Luftwaffe's strength in the West.
It sounds a bit like the Air Force was willing to risk the Army to solve its own problems. A tricky calculation.
Yeah.
And the man driving this forward was Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations.
That's him. Mountbatten was under direct orders from Churchill to plan raids of increasing size and intensity. After Rudder got canceled, Mountbatten was the one pushing relentlessly to relaunch it immediately as Operation Jubilee. And his reasoning, well, it's almost breathtakingly arrogant in hindsight. He argued the Germans would never expect the Allies to be stupid enough to attack the exact same port they'd clearly just been targeting. He thought the Germans would assume the Allies had moved on, that hitting the same spot again was too obvious, too irrational.
Counting on the enemy to think you're too sensible to repeat a failed plan. Wow.
Supreme confidence, or maybe hubris. But even with that boldness, the plan was crippled from the start by a lack of firepower, especially heavy fire support. They initially planned for a heavy aerial bombardment to soften up the defenses. It was approved, and then canceled.
Wait, canceled? The bombardment. That seems insane. Surely hitting the German guns was priority number one.
You'd think so. But the ground commanders, especially Major General Roberts, who was commanding the 2nd Canadian Division, got worried. They feared that a massive bombing would just pulverize the town, fill the narrow streets with rubble, and completely block the path for their tanks. They had 58 Churchill tanks, brand new, supposed to be the spearhead. They decided that tank mobility was more important than suppressing the German defenses.
So they chose clear streets for tanks over knocking out the guns that would kill the infantry trying to get to those streets.
Essentially, yes, a decision that proved utterly tragically wrong. The tanks never got into the town anyway.
And naval support, battleships, cruisers, something that could really hammer those cliffside bunkers.
Mountbatten asked for them. He wanted heavy naval gunfire support. But the Admiralty, specifically the First Sea Lord, Sir Dudley Pound, refused, flat out. Pound was haunted by the loss of the Prince of Wales and repulsed to Japanese aircraft the previous year. That disaster fundamentally changed naval thinking. There was this deep-seated fear of risking major warships, capital ships, anywhere they didn't have guaranteed total air supremacy, which they knew they wouldn't have over Dieppe.
So no battleships. What did they get?
Just 6 Hunt-class destroyers. Small ships, small guns. Not nearly enough to tackle fortified concrete bunkers and artillery embedded in cliffs. So the troops were going ashore against heavy fortifications with almost no effective fire support from the sea or the air. They were incredibly exposed.
So the whole plan is shaped by Soviet pressure, RAF priorities, fear of rubble, and the Navy's fear of losing ships. A real mix of constraints. And the force itself reflects that. About 10,500 men.
Roughly, yes. Mostly the untested 2nd Canadian Division. Plus British commandos and about 50 U.S. Army Rangers getting their first taste of action in Europe, and those 58 Churchill tanks. Some were adapted for shallow water wading, this new technology, but crucially, nobody seemed to have properly accounted for the beach itself, that unique, destructive Dieppe shingle.
Okay, so the fleet sails. Undercover darkness, minesweepers go first. The plan is intricate. Landings on 6 beaches simultaneously. Yellow, blue, red, white, green, orange. Flank attacks first, then the main punch in the center.
A complex symphony intended to hit everywhere at once, but the very first note was disastrously off-key. Hours before the main landings, around 3:48 in the morning, disaster struck on the eastern flank. The landing craft carrying No. 3 Commando heading for yellow and blue beaches near Puys and Berneval, they sailed straight into a small German coastal convoy. Just bad luck, but fatal.
A random encounter, and that blew the surprise.
Completely. There was a short, vicious firefight out there in the dark. Machine guns, cannon fire, the sound carried across the water. Every German defender for miles around was instantly alerted. The absolutely critical element of surprise, gone. Just like that, before the main force was anywhere near the shore.
Let's trace the impact. Yellow Beach, the easternmost landing.
Not of 3 Commando. Their target was the Big Gubble's coastal battery.
That's right. 3 heavy 170-millimeter guns, 4 105 millimeters, a major threat to the main fleet offshore. But because of that naval clash, the commando force got scattered. The main landing basically failed. Most boats never even made it to the right spot.
But there was a small group that did land.
Yes, a tiny group, just 18 men, led by Major Peter Young. They managed to land at a spot called Yellow II. And what they did was remarkable. They got ashore, scaled the cliffs under fire, and reached the perimeter of the Goebbels battery. They couldn't destroy the huge guns, obviously, not with just rifles and Bren guns, but they laid down such intense, accurate small arms fire on the gun crews that the Germans couldn't properly aim their guns at the main Allied fleet assembling offshore. The battery ended up firing wildly, inaccurately.
So those 18 guys essentially neutralized a major coastal battery just by harassing it, preventing it from sinking the troop ship.
Pretty much an incredible piece of improvisation and bravery. They bought crucial time and likely saved many lives out at sea before they were eventually forced to pull back. A small success born from chaos.
But that success wasn't replicated nearby at Blue Beach, at Huys, where the Royal Regiment of Canada landed.
No. Blue Beach was a catastrophe, because the Germans were now fully alert thanks to that earlier firefight. And worse, the Royals were delayed. Navigational errors meant they hit the beach 20 minutes late. By then, the sun was starting to rise. The planned cover of darkness and smoke, gone.
20 minutes. The difference between maybe having a chance and annihilation.
Annihilation is the right word. They came ashore into a perfect kill zone. The Germans had machine guns sighted in the cliffs, in houses covering every inch of that narrow beach. The Canadians were pinned down instantly against the seawall. They couldn't advance, couldn't retreat effectively. It was just a slaughter.
Yeah.
Of the 556 men who landed there, 200 were killed. 264 captured. Almost the entire regiment wiped out in minutes.
This is horrific. So the eastern flank is either scattered or destroyed. What about the western flank?
Right.
Beach?
Orange Beach at Farringeville was the one unqualified success of the entire operation. This was number 4 Commando, and crucially, they had those 50 U.S. Army Rangers integrated with them. They landed perfectly on time, undetected, total surprise achieved. They climbed the steep slope, assaulted the German position, the Hesse battery with its 650-millimeter guns, and neutralized it. Completely destroyed the guns.
So that's what was supposed to happen everywhere else.
Exactly. It showed the plan could work, but only with absolute surprise and perfect execution. Because they achieved their objective and maintained surprise, most of number 4 Commando, including the Rangers, were able to withdraw safely later on. The textbook example of how it should have gone.
Okay, moving inwards from the west flank to Green Beach at Portville, the South Saskatchewan Regiment.
They landed at 04.52, and initially they were undetected too. Looked promising. But disaster struck again, this time with navigation. Their landing craft drifted way off course, putting them down west of the River Sai. Their objectives, the high ground overlooking Dieppe, were all east of the river.
So they landed on the wrong side of the river.
Yes, which meant the entire regiment got funneled towards the only crossing point, the single bridge in the village of Portville. And of course, the Germans had that bridge covered perfectly with machine guns. The advance just slammed to a halt right there. The support battalion, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada, they got pinned down there too.
Wasn't that where Lieutenant Colonel Merritt won the Victoria Cross?
It was. An unbelievable display of courage. Merritt repeatedly walked across that bridge, completely exposed to intense fire, waving his helmet, shouting encouragement, trying to rally his men. Just extraordinary bravery. But even that couldn't overcome the tactical situation. The advance stalled. They couldn't take the high ground. Eventually, they were forced to withdraw. Only about 341 men from those 2 regiments managed to get back onto the boats.
But there was something else happening at Portville, wasn't there? Something about a radar station.
Yes, the intelligence coup hidden within the failure. An RAF radar technician, Flight Sergeant Jack Nissenthal, went ashore with the South Saskatchewans. His mission was highly secret. Get inside the German Freya radar station near Portville, or at least gather vital intelligence about it. He had a small bodyguard of men. He couldn't break through the defenses to get inside the station itself. The fighting was too heavy. But under intense fire, crawling along the ground, he managed to cut all the telephone lines connecting the radar station to German headquarters.
Why was cutting phone lines so important?
Because it forced the German radar operators to use their radios to report everything they were seeing. And that radio traffic was immediately picked up by listening stations back in Britain. So while Nissenthal didn't get the physical components he ideally wanted, his action provided invaluable real-time intelligence on exactly what the German radar could see, how they reported, and confirmed the capabilities of the Freya system. A tactical failure for him personally, but a major intelligence win for the Allies.
Okay, we absolutely have to pivot now and look at this from the German perspective, because their defense wasn't just luck. It was brutally effective. Why were they so ready?
Several reasons. They weren't caught completely cold. German intelligence had picked up some warning signs. They had warnings from French double agents about troop movements in England. They detected increased radio chatter and seen the concentrations of landing craft in British ports through aerial reconnaissance before rudder was canceled. They knew something was likely coming, even if they didn't know exactly when or where after rudder was scrubbed. They were on a higher state of alert than usual along the whole Channel coast.
And the defenses at Dieppe itself were formidable.
Extremely formidable. The garrison, about 1,500 men from the 3-2nd Static Infantry Division, wasn't an elite mobile unit, but they were well-trained for defensive fighting and knew their ground. And they occupied incredibly strong positions. Heavy artillery pieces were sighted brilliantly, often dug into caves in the cliff faces, making them almost invulnerable to the light naval gunfire the Allies brought. Machine gun nests were perfectly placed to create interlocking fields of fire, covering every single possible landing spot on the beaches. Those beaches weren't just beaches, they were pre-sighted, pre-registered kill zones. The Germans had prepared meticulously.
And their commanders seemed to understand the likely Allied approach.
Yes, there was good strategic thinking. The overall commander in the West, Field Marshal Geert von Rundstedt, had correctly anticipated that any major Allied raid would likely involve a massive air effort trying to gain temporary air superiority. So they were prepared for an assault supported from the air. They weren't surprised by the scale of the RAF involvement.
You mentioned the Freya radar at Pourville earlier. Can you expand on that? What exactly was Freya, and how crucial was its warning?
Freya was one of the main German early warning radar systems, quite sophisticated for its time. Its strength was its range. So at 3:45 a.m., even while that naval skirmish was happening miles offshore and hadn't really been reported effectively by the German boats involved, the Freya operator at Pourville detected the main Allied fleet. He identified 5 distinct columns of ships stationary at that point, about 35 kilometers out. That report went straight up the command chain.
So well before the main landing.
Well before. And then about an hour later, around 4:35 a.m., as the fleet started its final approach, another radar warning went out. That triggered a full, immediate alert for the entire Dieppe garrison. By 5:05 a.m., German artillery batteries even further away, like at Le Havre, were already receiving orders and starting to open fire on the approaching ships. That radar warning was absolutely crucial. It ensured that any element of surprise the Allies might have hoped for on the main beaches was completely gone by the time the troops arrived.
So the German reaction wasn't panicked scrambling, it was methodical. They were executing a practiced defensive plan.
Precisely. And you see that in their after-action reports, too. They were quite critical of the Allied plan. Rundstedt and other commanders called it rigid, overly complex, even incomprehensible. General Konrad Haas, the local corps commander, basically said it was madness to expect a single division, even a reinforced one, to successfully assault a prepared German regiment holding those cliffs.
And the air battle. The Germans felt confident there, too.
Very confident. They were delighted with how well the FW-190 performed against the Spitfires, especially the older MKBs. They put their success down to better aircraft performance at the altitudes the fighting occurred, and, as they saw it, more aggressive pilots with better training for that kind of engagement. For the Germans, Dieppe reinforced their belief. Strong coastal defenses, combined with a rapid, effective air response, could defeat any Allied landing attempt. Rundstedt's quote really sums it up. He acknowledged the Allies learned a lot, maybe more than the Germans did, precisely because they paid such a terrible price for those lessons. A chilling assessment.
Which brings us to the main beaches. Red and white, the center of the assault. If the flanks were disastrous, what happened here?
Pure, unadulterated carnage. This was where the main weight of the Canadian assault was supposed to hit, spearheaded by the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Essex Scottish Regiment. They came ashore already disadvantaged because the tank support they were promised wasn't there yet. The tanks landed late, so the infantry hit the beach first, and were met instantly with absolutely devastating machine gun and mortar fire cascading down from the German positions on the cliffs and in the town's casino complex overlooking the beaches.
The tanks arriving late was bad enough, but when they did arrive, they hit that other problem we mentioned, the beach itself.
The shingle. It's hard to overstate what a disaster this was. Dieppe Beach isn't firm sand. It's deep, loose banks of large, smooth pebbles. Chert, mostly. Allied intelligence on this was shockingly poor. Apparently, they relied on outdated geological surveys and even holiday photos, which just didn't convey the reality of trying to move heavy tracked vehicles over it. So, of the 29 Churchill tanks that actually made it ashore, 2 sank in deeper water trying to land. But 12 of them, nearly half, immediately got stuck, bogged down right there on the beach. Their tracks, the sand tracks they had, just couldn't grip the shifting stones. They spun uselessly.
So all the work adapting them for wading through water was irrelevant because they couldn't even cross the beach. An unbelievable intelligence failure.
It absolutely was, and it doomed the infantry. Without tank support to suppress the German bunkers, they were trapped on the open beach. Only 15 tanks actually managed to struggle across the shingle and over the seawall. But then they were immediately stopped again by concrete anti-tank blocks the Germans had placed at the entrances to the town streets, so they were trapped. Caught between the enemy fire from the town, the cliffs behind them, and the rising tide, they became static targets. Every single tanker who landed on red and white beaches was either killed or captured. Not one tank got back to England. The infantry exposed on that killing ground were just cut down in droves.
And adding to the tragedy, the commander offshore, Major General Roberts, didn't even realize how bad it was. The smokescreen actually blinded him.
It's a terrible irony. The smoke laid by aircraft and destroyers was meant to protect the troops. But it also completely obscured the view from Roberts' command ship offshore. Combined with the chaos, the breakdown of radio communications radios just didn't work well under the shadow of those high cliffs. Roberts was operating in a complete fog of war. He was getting fragmented, confusing reports. He knew things weren't going well, but he didn't grasp the sheer scale of the annihilation on red and white beaches. So, believing the initial assault might just be stalled, not destroyed, he made the decision to commit his reserves.
Sending more troops into that meat grinder.
Exactly. First, the Fusiliers Mont Royal. They headed towards the shore in 26 landing craft. They were spotted immediately. Machine gun fire, mortars, grenades, they just ripped into the landing craft. Many were destroyed before they even reached the beach. Utter devastation. Then came the last reserve, the Royal Marines Commandos. They were heading in, but already taking heavy fire during the transfer from their ships to the smaller landing craft. Boats were sinking all around them.
That must have been the moment of awful realization for the commanders on the water, seeing it unfold.
It must have been. The sources mention the actions of the Marine commander, Lieutenant Colonel Phillips. As his own landing craft approached the inferno, and seeing others being blown up, he stood on the stern. Under heavy fire, he began signaling frantically to the rest of his boats behind him to turn back, to abort the landing. It was a selfless act, trying to save the remaining men from certain death. He was killed by German fire just moments later. But his signal probably did save some of the last few craft from landing. By this point, it was undeniable even from offshore. The attack had totally collapsed. High Command finally gave the order for a general withdrawal.
And even that massive air effort, 2,500 sorties, couldn't turn the tide. You mentioned the new Spitfire Mark 9s made its debut.
It did. The MKX was the first Allied fighter truly capable of taking on the FW-190 on more or less equal terms. But the problem was geography and endurance. Dieppe was right at the edge of the Spitfire's effective combat radius from bases in southern England. Pilots typically only had about 5 minutes of actual fighting time over the target area before their fuel state forced them to turn back.
5 minutes. That's nothing.
Hardly enough to establish air superiority or provide meaningful close air support to the troops on the ground who were being hammered by artillery and mortars the planes couldn't easily spot or suppress. Plus, the intelligence system set up to monitor and process German radar signals and radio communications. It was completely overwhelmed. The sheer volume of German reaction fighters scrambling, reinforcements being called in, swamped the analysts. They couldn't provide timely intelligence back to the commanders.
So the retreat itself, starting around 9:40 in the morning, must have been hellish too.
4 more hours of hell, trying to get the wounded and the survivors off those exposed beaches back onto the few remaining landing craft, all under continuous, accurate German fire. The withdrawal wasn't complete until about 2:00 p.m., a brutal end to a brutal day.
The aftermath. The numbers. Let's talk about the cost.
The cost was just staggering, especially for the Canadians who formed the bulk of the assault force. Of the nearly 5,000 Canadian soldiers who took part, 3,367 were casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Think about that. a 68% casualty rate for the Canadian contingent. In a single day, it's almost unbelievable. 1,874 Canadians were taken prisoner alone. Overall, Allied casualties, including British commandos and the U.S. Rangers, were 3,623 out of the 6,086 men who actually made it ashore.
And the German losses, by comparison?
Minimal. Around 591 casualties in total, with 322 killed or missing. They did lose 48 aircraft, which was significant for the Luftwaffe in the West, but on the ground, it was an overwhelming defensive victory.
And the Germans wasted no time in using it for propaganda, did they?
Oh, immediately. Goebbels had a field day. Dieppe was portrayed as a complete military farce, proof of Allied incompetence and the impregnability of fortress Europe. It gets even more surreal. Marshal Pétain, the head of Vichy France, actually sent a formal letter congratulating the German army for, quote, cleansing French soil of the invader.
Wow. And Hitler?
Hitler used it too. He made a grand gesture, awarding the town of Dieppe 10 million francs and releasing 750 French POWs who came from the area. He cited the townspeople's perfect discipline and calm during the battle. It was all about reinforcing the image of German strength and French collaboration, a huge psychological win for the Nazis.
But beyond the propaganda, the real legacy of Dieppe, the one that echoed down to D-Day, was the lessons learned, the incredibly harsh lessons.
Yes. Dieppe became, almost overnight, the ultimate what-not-to-do manual for amphibious assaults. The cost was horrific, but the knowledge gained was invaluable, and it directly informed the planning for Normandy 2 years later.
Can we break down those key lessons?
Sure. Lesson 1, maybe the biggest. The absolute need for overwhelming preliminary bombardment. Air, naval, artillery, you had to utterly saturate and destroy fixed defenses before the first troops hit the beach. No more relying on surprise alone against prepared positions. Lesson 2, the critical importance of surprise. Once it was lost at Dieppe, especially due to that early naval encounter, the whole intricate plan started to unravel. For D-Day, achieving surprise became paramount.
Lesson 3 must be intelligence, right?
Yeah.
Especially on the terrain.
Absolutely. Much, much better intelligence on fortifications, gun positions, and crucially, the actual physical nature of the landing beaches. No more guesswork based on holiday snaps. They needed engineers and commandos doing covert beach reconnaissance. Lesson 4. Avoid frontal assaults on heavily defended ports. Dieppe proved it was likely impossible to capture a major port like Cherbourg or Le Havre intact. The conclusion was you destroy it in the process of capturing it.
Which led to...
Lesson 6, jumping ahead slightly, the need for prefabricated mulberry harbors. If you can't capture a port, you have to bring your own. A revolutionary idea born directly from the failure at Dieppe. And Lesson 5, going back, the need for specialized armored vehicles. The standard Churchills getting stuck in the shingle was a disaster. This led directly to the development of Hobart's funnies for D-Day tanks designed to clear mines, bridge gaps, lay tracks, and deal with beach obstacles. Engineering solutions for engineering problems.
And finally, the air power lesson.
Lesson 7, the need for a truly integrated tactical air force. Not just fighters flying separate missions, but ground attack aircraft working directly with the troops on the ground under unified command, providing immediate responsive fire support. Dieppe showed the limitations of relying solely on high-level air superiority sweeps.
So, in light of all that, did the commanders, like Mountbatten, feel the cost was justified?
Publicly, yes. Mountbatten famously argued later that for every man who died in Dieppe, at least 10 more must have been spared in Normandy in 1944. Churchill also made statements suggesting the lessons learned justified the heavy price. It's a grim kind of military calculus, isn't it? Weighing lives lost now against potential lives saved later.
Before we wrap up the aftermath, we need to touch on that persistent theory, the Enigma connection. Was Dieppe really just cover for a secret intelligence mission?
It's a fascinating and well-supported theory, though perhaps not the sole reason for the raid. The context is crucial. Bletchley Park, the British code-breaking center, was having major trouble reading the new German four-rotor Enigma machine being introduced by the U-boats for their shark cipher. Losing visibility of U-boat movements was catastrophic for the Battle of the Atlantic. Naval intelligence, which included Ian Fleming at the time, believed they desperately needed to capture one of these new machines and its associated codebooks.
And Dieppe offered an opportunity.
The theory is that the main raid provided the necessary cover and distraction for a specialist unit number 30 commando, sometimes called X-Troop or Fleming's Red Indians, to make a targeted dash for the German naval headquarters in Dieppe Harbor. Their specific mission, codenamed Pinch, was allegedly to seize Enigma materials. The captured operational orders for some commando units did include instructions to prioritize securing all documents, etc., of value, and specifically mentioned items like a respirator, thought to be a code word for the Enigma machine itself. While the commandos involved never reached the headquarters due to the failure of the main assault, the existence of these orders lends strong credence to the idea that an intelligence pinch was at least a significant secondary objective of the operation.
A raid within a raid. Okay, let's move to the epilogue. The echoes of Dieppe went beyond military lessons, didn't they? The shackle crisis.
Yes, a very dark consequence. Remember that copy of the Allied operational plan that was captured by the Germans when Brigadier Southam was taken prisoner? Critically, that plan contained an order apparently issued at a lower level and perhaps not fully authorized by the top brass, but it was there in writing instructing Allied troops to shackle any German prisoners they took. The rationale was supposedly to prevent them from destroying documents.
So the Allies planned to shackle Germans, and the Germans found the order.
Exactly. When the Germans discovered this written order on the captured plan, they were furious. On September 2nd, they announced that, in direct reprisal, they would shackle the Allied prisoners captured at Dieppe. The British War Office tried to backtrack, deny the order's validity, but the Germans went ahead on October 8, 1942, and shackled Canadian and British POWs. This triggered a nasty tit-for-tat. The Allies then started shackling German POWs in Canada and Britain. It went back and forth for a while.
A really grim cycle, all stemming from that one captured document at Dieppe. And it had longer-term consequences, too.
It did. Hitler later explicitly cited the Dieppe shackling order and the commando nature of the raid as part of his justification for issuing the infamous commando order later in 1942. That order decreed that any Allied commandos captured, even in uniform, were to be summarily executed, not treated as prisoners of war. Dieppe cast a long, dark shadow.
Even the war cemetery at Dieppe has a unique story, doesn't it?
It does. The Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery is laid out differently from most Commonwealth war grave cemeteries. The headstones are placed back-to-back in long double rows. This unusual layout wasn't chosen by the Allies. It was how the Germans initially buried the Canadian dead when they controlled the area immediately after the raid. After the liberation of France in 1944, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission decided to maintain that German layout rather than disturb the graves to rearrange them into the standard single rows. So the cemetery itself remains a unique physical reminder of that day and its immediate aftermath under German control.
So we end up back where Field Marshal von Rundstedt was. His assessment that the Allies learned a huge amount, precisely because the cost was so appallingly high. A brutal asymmetrical learning curve, as you said.
It truly was. Rapid, harsh lessons paid for in blood on those beaches.
So Operation Jubilee, Dieppe, undeniably a monumental tactical failure. The cost in lives, in men captured, was just horrific and immediate. But that terrible price, it bought knowledge, essential knowledge about bombardment, intelligence, specialized tanks, about not hitting ports head-on, knowledge that fundamentally reshaped Allied planning and, arguably, contributed directly to the success of D-Day.
And that leaves you, the listener, with that profound, uncomfortable question. Can strategic gain, the potential saving of lives years down the line, ever truly justify such an immediate, devastating tactical loss? How do we weigh the lives sacrificed on that shingle beach against the lives perhaps saved on the beaches of Normandy 2 years later? It's the cold, hard calculus of war, and Dieppe forces us to confront it head-on.
A sobering thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Operation Jubilee. Fire on the shores. We'll see you next time.